Okay, so you know that story, the one everyone and their grandma knows.
Hmm.
Adam and Eve. Yeah, well, we're diving deep into that today. Forbidden fruit, that whole thing. But what I've told you, there's more to it, like way more stuff that can actually, I think, it can help us deal with like temptations we face, like today.
It really is true. What we're going to do is we're going to use this Christian podcast episode. It's really fascinating. And what we're going to see is that this story, it's not just some event that happened way back when. It's like an allegory,
Yeah,
for being human. And it's amazing, this podcast, even though it's in Spanish, it really makes you realize these themes, they're timeless.
it's true, right? Some stories, they just speak to everyone, no matter what language. So just so we're clear, we're not here to debate whether you believe it or not. It's more about how this story, this one story from Genesis chapter 3, it shaped like how we think about everything. Temptation, even, well, fig leaves, right?
And speaking of that serpent, right away, this podcast episode, it says something interesting. It says that the word in Hebrew for serpent, it's nahash. And it doesn't just mean snake. It's got this deeper meaning. It can mean like cunning or malicious. You know what I mean?
So not just some random snake that learned how to talk, this Nahash. It's more like
Yeah.
the idea of temptation, right? Like all temptations wrapped up in one.
Exactly. And here's something interesting. The word nahash, it's not always bad in the Bible. Sometimes it's like connected to being wise or even predicting the future. So maybe it's saying the difference between temptation, something good that pulls you in, and maybe even the potential to learn and grow. It's like a thin line, you know?
Okay, so this serpent, it's not just a Disney villain anymore. It's more like this force
Mhm.
inside us. But how does that change how we see why Eve gets tempted?
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. This podcast episode, it looks at a few different ways to look at it. So one way is Eve, she heard God's instructions secondhand, like through Adam, right? And maybe something got lost in translation.
Like that telephone game we used to play. Someone starts with a message, and by the time it gets to the end, it's totally different.
Yeah, exactly. Another way to look at it is maybe Eve, she was already kind of into the fruit, like she was drawn to it, which means she's, got to own her choices. And then there's this idea that maybe Adam, he didn't protect her as much as he should have. But here's the thing, no matter how you see it, this podcast, it wants us to pay attention to how clever that serpent is. It didn't just like randomly pick Eve, it, targeted a weakness, like it was trying to break that connection we have with God.
And isn't that how temptation works? It
Yeah.
doesn't just come out of nowhere. It uses like our weak spots, our insecurities, those little like cracks in our armor.
Exactly. And this podcast, it's really encouraging us to be more aware. Like detectives in our own lives, we got to spot those weaknesses before, they get used against us. Because let's face it, there's serpents everywhere.
Oh, I know it. You know that voice in your head telling you to skip the gym? That's a serpent right there. Or those ads online that like promise you the world.
Yeah. Or even sneakier, how about those political ads? The ones that try to scare you or make you mad?
Totally.
Yeah.
These tactics, they never get old, do they?
Nope, they really don't. Which is why I find it so interesting how this podcast, it breaks down what the serpent does. It's like this guidebook to like manipulation 101, but instead of some fancy textbook, we're using an ancient text. So step one in the serpent's playbook, doubt.
Right. That little whisper, did God really say?
Hmm.
It never gets old, does it? And here, the serpent isn't even saying, like, something different. Not yet, anyway. It's just making her wonder if God was being straight with her. And this tactic, it's everywhere.
Oh, tell me about it. Like when you see those headlines, the ones that are like, scientists disagree, or when someone's trying to get to you and they're like, are you even sure about that? Really? Yeah. They just plant that little seed of doubt, and it can really get to you, even when deep down you're like, this is crazy.
So doubt is step one. What's next? What does the serpent do next?
So once that seed is planted, the serpent, it just comes right out and says it. You will not surely die. Totally contradicting God, right? It's risky, but it works. Why? Because now there's a different version of reality.
And a lot of times, that other version, it sounds better, even if it's a lie. It's like those ads, get rich quick or lose weight instantly. They promise you everything, but, deep down, it can't be that easy.
You got it. That idea of a shortcut, like you can cheat the system, it's tempting. And this serpent, it knows exactly how to push those buttons.
And then comes the grand finale. This is a good one. The serpent offers Eve forbidden knowledge of good and evil. Something tells me it wasn't a boring lecture, though.
Definitely not. It's offered like it's the golden ticket, like now you'll be just like God, the ultimate power up, right? And it speaks to what we all want deep down, to be in control, to understand everything, to know all the secrets of the universe.
Oh, I totally see how that's tempting.
Yeah.
Especially nowadays. I mean, we're drowning in information 24/7. It's like you can't resist. You have to click on that conspiracy theory video, or you think you've got it all figured out, but really we've barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, exactly. Wanting to know things, that's good. But the serpent, it reminds us not all knowledge is good knowledge. Sometimes trying to know too much, well, it can lead you down a bad path.
Okay, so the serpent's made its move. Eve takes a bite. What happens next? Like right away, what does the podcast say?
Well, first thing, this is a small detail, but it's important. They feel shame. Before anything else, Adam and Eve, they realize they're naked and they're ashamed.
Right, but it's not just about being naked, is it? There's something deeper going on.
You're exactly right. The podcast, it says that being naked here, it means they've lost their innocence. Like that perfect connection with God, it's broken. Before, it was fine being vulnerable, but now they need to hide. It's like you ever tell a lie, even a little one, and suddenly it's like awkward between you and the person you lied to, you know? That's what Adam and Eve, that's what they're feeling. They're separated from their true selves and from God.
And the fig leaves. Um, I mean, come on. Trying to hide with fig leaves. It's kind of funny, but also, like, we've all been there, right?
Absolutely. That's what the podcast is saying. Fig leaves, it's like all those things we do to hide our shame, our mistakes, from ourselves even, and from God. Like we build walls, we get busy, we tell ourselves stories. But those fig leaves, they only cover so much, you know?
They're not really fixing anything.
Yeah.
The problem is still there, that broken connection with God. And speaking of broken, that's when things really hit the ground. No more paradise, right?
Right. And the podcast makes a good point. It's not like God is up there like plotting revenge. It's more like, well, there are consequences. God made the rules and they broke them. So now things are going to play out.
Okay, but let's get into those consequences, because it's not just a slap on the wrist, right?
Definitely not. The podcast, it goes through each one like really carefully, and it ties them back to what the serpent did, what Eve did, and what Adam did. We should start with the serpent because that one, it's really something.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay, so the serpent, it gets cursed. It has to crawl around on its belly, eating dust. Now, at first, you might think, okay, that's physical. But this podcast, it wants us to think deeper.
Because it's really about being humiliated. Like being knocked down a few pegs. No more fancy talking snake.
You got it. And remember we were talking about how Nahash, sometimes it's like wisdom. Well, this curse, it's like wisdom twisted. It becomes all about tricking people, taking advantage. Kind of like, those people who get ahead by stepping on everyone else. It might do what they want for a little while, but it'll catch up with them.
Karma. But it doesn't end there, right?
Yeah.
There's that thing about the serpent's offspring and the woman's offspring. Like, they're going to be enemies forever.
Yeah, that's a big one. People see that as like this prophecy that good and evil, they're going to be fighting. Always. Throughout history, even.
So even when it looks really bad, there's this little hint of hope, right? But okay, what about Eve? What happens to her? That's a little more complicated.
Yeah, and the podcast doesn't try to make it easy. It talks about how your conception will be multiplied in sorrow. Basically childbirth. Yeah, it's going to be hard.
Which, I mean, that's real life, isn't it? Outside of Eden, I mean. Things aren't easy. There's going to be struggle, pain, all that.
Exactly. And it kind of shows how now that they're outside of God's plan, things are out of whack. But
Right.
the podcast is really clear about this. This isn't about punishing women.
Definitely not. It's more like, now that sin is in the world, everything is messed up. Even between men and women, that relationship too.
Exactly. And about that, the podcast, it talks about that part where it says Eve will desire her husband and he'll rule over her. You know that one.
Yeah, and that one, I don't know. It always feels a little off, doesn't it?
Yeah, and the podcast doesn't try to say it's not. It just it shows the different ways people see it, And it makes you think about it. Like, what do you think it means?
Which is what this is all about, right? Thinking about this stuff, even when there's not like a clear answer.
Right.
Okay, so Eve's got her consequences. The serpent's out of there.
Yeah.
What about Adam? What's his deal?
Remember all that relaxing in the garden? Yeah, that's over. Now it's going to be hard work all the time. The earth, which used to give them everything, now it's going to be thorns and weeds.
That's rough. It's
Yeah.
like going from ordering takeout to having to actually go to the store, cook, the whole thing.
Exactly. No more easy life. And then, of course, there's the big one. The one that hangs over all of us. Death. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return, God says.
Wow. We're not getting out of this life alive, are we?
Yeah.
And that's for everyone, not just them. It's a lot to take in, for sure. But, even with all that, this podcast episode, it shows how God is still, like, looking out for them. It's a small thing, but it really makes you think.
You mean when God makes clothes for them, right?
Yeah.
They tried to cover up with those fig leaves, remember? Which we talked about how that never really works. And then God steps in and he makes them clothes from animal skins.
It's like, when you totally mess up and
Yeah.
you're in way over your head, and then someone, like, out of the blue, they help you.
Exactly. And it's not just the clothes, it's what it means. Like, those animal skins, they make you think about, like, a sacrifice later on, a way to make things right, for sin.
Yeah, it's like there's this promise built right into their clothes, a promise that things are going to be okay again. But before we go too far, there's this other thing. This is interesting. Eve, she finally gets a name. Up to now, she's just the woman, right? But now, she's Eve. Why is that important, according to the podcast?
It's a big deal. The podcast, it talks about what her name means in Hebrew, Chava. And get this, it's like related to the word for life. It's like saying, even with everything that's happened, there's still, a chance for things to be new again.
It's like no matter how bad things get, there's always hope. Somewhere. Okay, so we've got clothes, we've got names, and now the big finale, they get kicked out of the garden. Talk about an eviction notice. What do you think this podcast, why does it spend so much time on that part?
It's not just about, like, punishing them, Remember that tree of life, the one in the garden? God, he kicks them out, but it's like he's protecting them from something worse than death, living forever, but totally cut off from him.
It's kind of like he's doing them a favor, in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And the podcast, it uses this image. I love this. These angels, cherubim, right at the entrance of the garden, and they've got this flaming sword. Like, nope, you can't go back.
Like closing the door on a chapter,
Yeah.
Yeah, it was rough, but they had to go through it to grow and to eventually, find their way back to God. So we've covered a lot. What are some things you hope, like our listeners, what will they remember from all this?
Well, I hope they see this story, Adam and Eve. It's not just something you hear in, like, Sunday school. It's about all of us, like the good and the bad that we're capable of, how easily we can be tempted, and how much we all want, like, real connection, real meaning.
Yeah, and we see those same things happening today, right? The doubting, the temptation, making excuses, it's all still there.
Absolutely. But when you understand it, really get it, you're in a better place. You can fight back. The podcast, it also talked about how important it is to own up to what we do. Adam and Eve, they tried to blame everyone else. But you got to own your choices.
Which, not easy. But that's how you grow, right?
Yeah.
But here's the good part, and the podcast, it ends on this too. It's not all doom and gloom. We mess up, there's consequences, but there's also grace, forgiveness, and a chance to start over.
That's something to hold on to, isn't it?
Totally. So to everyone listening, as you go about your day, think about this. Where do you see this story, Adam and Eve? Not just in the Bible, but in your own life. What temptations do you face? What are your, fig leaves, the things you hide behind? And the big question, how are you going to choose to respond?